The presidency almost no one wanted to hold. There are moments in history when power is chased relentlessly, and then there are moments when it becomes a burden, inherited, unwanted, even feared. This was one of those moments when the most powerful office in the nation felt less like a prize and more like a trap. What usually inspires ambition instead inspired hesitation, not because the office had lost its formal authority, but because the conditions surrounding it made that authority feel dangerously fragile. The presidency didn't open with celebration. It opened with hesitation. Allies stepped back. Rivals stayed quiet. And behind closed doors, the question wasn't who should lead, but who would dare to. Silence filled spaces where ambition normally lived. The absence of eager candidates spoke louder than any speech, signaling that those closest to power understood the risk embedded in the moment. To understand why this presidency was so reluctant, we have to return to the conditions surrounding it. The nation was unstable. Trust in leadership was thin. Every decision carried the risk of backlash, escalation, or collapse. Whoever stepped into the role would inherit unresolved crises, fractured institutions, and expectations no one could realistically meet. There was no clean slate waiting, only accumulated pressure. This wasn't a moment for ambition. It was a moment that punished it. The traditional rewards of leadership, influence, legacy, accomplishment, were overshadowed by the certainty of blame. Success would be invisible. Failure would be immediate and unforgiving. For many, the rational choice was to stay away. Potential leaders understood the danger. One wrong move could define a legacy forever. One compromise could alienate half the country. One decisive act could trigger consequences no one could reverse. And unlike other transitions of power, there was no clear path forward, only damage control. The presidency no longer promised the opportunity to shape the future, only the responsibility to prevent it from unraveling. The presidency itself had become exposed. Authority remained intact on paper, but confidence had eroded. The office could command, but it struggled to persuade. And without persuasion, power becomes brittle. Orders may still be issued, but compliance weakens when belief fades. The symbolic weight of the office no longer guaranteed unity. What made this moment extraordinary wasn't just a reluctance to lead, it was the awareness of cost. This presidency would not be remembered for bold vision or sweeping reform. It would be remembered for what went wrong under its watch, whether deserved or not. History, it seemed, was already sharpening its judgment before the term even began. Stepping into the role meant inheriting blame before action, criticism before decisions, judgment before outcomes. The timeline of accountability had inverted. Leaders would be held responsible not for what they did, but for what they could not prevent. Yet someone had to take the oath. And when they did, they didn't inherit power. They inherited responsibility, without protection, without patience, and without certainty that the office itself could still hold everything together. The safety net that once surrounded the presidency had thinned, leaving little margin for error. This was the presidency almost no one wanted, and the reasons why would soon become painfully clear. From the first days in office, the weight of expectation pressed down without relief. There was no grace period, no benefit of the doubt. Every statement was dissected, every pause interpreted, every compromise framed as failure, before its impact could even be measured. The presidency entered a constant state of evaluation, with no allowance for learning or adjustment. The president quickly realized this was not a role that allowed learning in public. Mistakes would not be forgiven as growing pains. They would be treated as proof that the office itself had lost credibility. The margin for experimentation vanished, forcing caution even when boldness might have helped. Inside the administration, urgency replaced optimism. The goal was no longer progress. It was stabilization, prevent escalation, avoid irreversible damage, keep institutions functioning long enough for trust to slowly return. This was governance as containment rather than construction. But stabilization is an invisible achievement. When it works, nothing happens. And when nothing happens, the public assumes nothing is being done. Absence of disaster does not feel like success, even when it is. That gap between effort and perception became the defining struggle of this presidency. Enormous energy was spent holding systems together, Yet little of it translated into visible reassurance. The work was constant, but the credit was non-existent. Every inherited crisis came with its own trap. Acting decisively risked deepening division. Acting cautiously looked like weakness. Delegating authority invited blame. Centralizing it invited suspicion. There was no clean move left on the board, only trade-offs that guaranteed dissatisfaction. What made this presidency especially difficult was the loss of institutional patience. Allies demanded reassurance immediately. Opponents exploited uncertainty instantly. Media cycles compressed time, turning long-term problems into daily verdicts. The pace of judgment outstripped the pace of governance. The president wasn't just governing a nation. They were governing a moment of disbelief. Disbelief in leadership, in institutions, and in the idea that anyone could still steer events meaningfully. Skepticism framed every action before it was taken. And yet, despite the pressure, the presidency held. Not firmly, not confidently, but deliberately. Each decision was weighed not for popularity, but for survivability, because walking away wasn't an option. And failure, if it came, would not be quiet. As the term progressed, the presidency began to reveal its quiet paradox. The more carefully power was exercised, the less visible it became. Success looked like absence. Stability looked like stagnation. And restraint felt indistinguishable from drift. Inside the administration, progress was measured differently. Crises were narrowed. Worst-case scenarios were avoided. Systems that had been close to breaking were kept intact through constant intervention. But none of this translated into confidence outside the White House. The public wanted direction. They wanted proof that the office still mattered, that leadership could still impose order on chaos. Instead, they saw complexity without closure, problems managed but not solved. This gap created a dangerous narrative, that the presidency itself was weakened, that power had evaporated, that authority no longer commanded respect. And narratives, once established, shape reality faster than facts. Opposition hardened. Allies hedged. Institutions began planning for uncertainty rather than coordination, not because leadership failed, but because belief had not yet returned. This is the hidden burden of an unwanted presidency. Every decision is judged not on merit, but on symbolism. Every compromise is framed as concession. Every delay becomes proof of incapacity. Yet, walking away from responsibility would have confirmed the worst fears. So the presidency endured, not heroically, not triumphantly, but steadily, absorbing criticism, managing risk, and preventing collapse one decision at a time. History often overlooks this phase, because endurance doesn't inspire, it doesn't excite, and it rarely satisfies. But without it, everything else falls apart. When this presidency finally ended, there was no collective sigh of relief, only exhaustion. The office had survived, but it hadn't been redeemed. The nation moved on without celebration, uncertain whether stability had been restored or merely postponed. And yet, looking back, something crucial becomes clear. The presidency almost no one wanted was the presidency that held when belief was weakest, when authority was doubted, when legitimacy felt fragile. It absorbed pressure that might have shattered the office entirely under a different kind of leadership. No sweeping victories defined it. No grand vision reshaped the future. But collapse was avoided. Institutions endured. The system lived to face another chapter. That is not a glamorous legacy, but it is a necessary one. History often rewards boldness. It remembers those who expand power, redefine eras, and dominate moments. It struggles to acknowledge those who simply prevent unraveling, who inherit chaos and leave it contained. This presidency reminds us that leadership isn't always about ambition. Sometimes it's about endurance, about standing still when everything demands reaction, about holding responsibility even when the reward is criticism. The office did not emerge stronger, but it emerged intact. And in moments when democracy feels brittle, that distinction matters more than we like to admit. So the question history leaves us with is simple. When power becomes a burden instead of a prize, who is willing to carry it anyway? The